Sometimes a man finds himself in the wilderness, not to escape the world, but to remember who he truly is. For 40 years, Elijah Cormack had called these Montana mountains home, seeking peace in their quiet embrace after life had taken more from him than he cared to count. His faithful dog Rufus was his only companion, the two of them living simply among the pines and granite peaks. Then one morning they found the stone, big as a wagon wheel, smooth and dark, covered in strange markings that made Elijah's hands shake. Rufus wouldn't go near it, whimpering like he sensed something dangerous. But Elijah felt drawn to it, like it was calling his name. His gut told him to cut it open, though he couldn't say why. What would a simple mountain man find hidden inside a mysterious stone that seemed to pulse with life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valleys like old memories, reluctant to let go of the night. Elijah Cormack stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his calloused hands. The boards beneath his boots had been worn smooth by decades of daily ritual. Coffee at dawn, scanning the horizon, listening to what the mountains had to say. At 72, his body carried the evidence of a life lived hard but honest, shoulders broad from splitting wood, and scarred from 1,000 small battles with nature. Eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen more than most men could bear. Rufus stretched beside him, a 12-year-old blue-tick hound whose muzzle had gone grey in perfect harmony with his master's beard. The dog's ears twitched at sounds only he could hear, a squirrel's chatter 3 ridges over, the distant cry of a hawk circling for breakfast. They'd been partners for 12 years now, ever since Elijah found him as a pup, half-starved and shivering by the roadside. Some folks might call it coincidence, but Elijah knew better. In these mountains, things found you when you needed them most. The cabin itself told stories in every weathered plank and mortared stone. Elijah had built it with his own hands after the war, not the big one that made headlines, but the smaller, more personal war that left him hollow inside. Vietnam had taken his youth, his faith in easy answers, and 3 of his closest friends. When he came home to Montana in 1973, he'd carried their dog tags in his pocket and their ghosts in his heart. The mountains had seemed like the only place vast enough to hold such grief. Sarah had understood, bless her soul. She'd been patient with his silences, gentle with his nightmares, strong enough to build a life alongside a man still learning how to live again. For 28 years, she'd filled the cabin with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Herb gardens and Sunday hymns hummed while hanging laundry. They'd talked of children, but never been blessed with any. So they'd poured their love into the land itself, tending a small garden, caring for injured wildlife, making their corner of the world a little more beautiful. Cancer took her on a Tuesday in November, 12 years ago now. Elijah still kept her favorite coffee mug on the shelf, still caught himself setting 2 plates for dinner. The grief had mellowed from sharp agony to a gentle ache, like an old injury that predicted weather changes. Rufus had arrived just 3 months after Sarah's funeral, as if the universe knew a man shouldn't face such mountains alone. These days, Elijah's routine rarely varied. Up before dawn to check his small weather station, a habit from his army meteorology training that had somehow become essential to civilian life. Coffee on the porch while listening to the mountain's morning symphony. Then the daily walk with Rufus, following trails he'd worn into the landscape over 4 decades. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down the mountain, which suited Elijah just fine. He'd grown accustomed to conversations with Rufus, with the trees, with Sarah's memory. The general store in Pine Creek saw him once a month when he drove down for supplies. Old Bill Henderson, the proprietor, had given up trying to engage him in town gossip years ago. Elijah would nod politely, purchase what he needed, coffee, salt, rifle cartridges, maybe a paperback novel, and disappear back into the high country. The townspeople respected his privacy, understanding that some men needed space the way others needed company. His small pension from the army covered the basics: supplemented by the occasional odd job for ranchers in the valley. Mostly, though, he lived off the land, hunting elk and deer in season, fishing the mountain streams, maintaining a small vegetable garden that Sarah had started. He'd learned to can vegetables, to smoke meat, to make do with what the mountains provided. Self-sufficiency had become both necessity and philosophy. The morning routine included checking his few tools and traps. He wasn't much for hunting anymore, but sometimes a family of raccoons would get into his stores, or a bear would need discouraging from the cabin. The mountains demanded respect, but they weren't cruel. If you understood the rules, they'd provide for you. It was civilization that confused him now, with its rushing and pushing and constant noise. Up here, life moved at the pace of seasons, and that suited a man whose soul had learned to value quiet. Rufus had his own routines, of course. The old dog would investigate the same fallen log every morning, marking his territory with the seriousness of a general surveying battlefields. He'd check the perimeter of their small clearing, nose to the ground, cataloguing the night's visitors. Usually it was just deer, maybe a fox or two. But this morning, something had the dog on edge. Elijah noticed it first in the way Rufus held his tail, not wagging, not tucked, but straight out like a pointer who'd found game. The dog's hackles weren't up exactly, but there was tension in his shoulders that spoke of unease. In 12 years together, Elijah had learned to read his companion's moods as clearly as weather patterns. Something was different today. They set off on their usual trail, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and quaking aspen. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant cabins, the earthy smell of fallen leaves beginning their slow transformation back to soil. October in the high country was Elijah's favorite time. The tourists had gone home, the hunting season hadn't quite begun, and the mountains settled into the peaceful rhythm that would carry them through winter. But today, even the familiar trail felt different. Rufus kept looking back at him with those intelligent brown eyes, as if checking to make sure they were still together. The dog's usual confident trot had become more cautious, more deliberate. When they reached the meadow where Sarah used to gather wildflowers, Rufus stopped entirely. The meadow should have been empty, except for the few hardy plants that bloomed late in the season. Instead, sitting in the center like it had grown there, was something that shouldn't exist. Elijah blinked hard, wondering if his old eyes were playing tricks. But no, there it was, solid and undeniable, a stone. Not just any stone, but something that made his breath catch in his throat. Bigger than his kitchen table, perfectly round, dark as obsidian, but shot through with veins of silver that seemed to move in the morning light. The surface was covered in markings, not scratches or natural erosion, but deliberate symbols carved deep into the rock. They looked almost like writing, but in no language Elijah had ever seen. Rufus whimpered, backing away with his ears flat against his head. The dog who'd faced down bears and mountain lions without flinching wouldn't take another step toward the stone. That should have been warning enough for any sensible man. But as Elijah stared at the impossible object, he felt something stirring in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name, a pull he couldn't explain. The stone seemed to hum, though he couldn't say if he heard it with his ears or felt it in his bones. The silver veins pulsed gently like a slow heartbeat, and the carved symbols seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Everything about it screamed wrongness, impossibility. Stones didn't appear overnight in meadows where a man had walked for 40 years. Stones didn't pulse with inner light or make dogs whimper with fear, but standing there in the crisp mountain air, with morning mist swirling around his boots and his faithful companion pressed against his legs, Elijah Cormack felt more awake than he had in 12 years. The stone was calling to him, though he couldn't have explained how he knew. It was calling, and deep in his weathered soul, some part of him was answering. For 3 days, Elijah couldn't stop thinking about the stone. He'd left it there in the meadow, walking home with Rufus pressed tight against his legs, both of them silent as church mice. But sleep wouldn't come easy anymore. He'd lie in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams Sarah had helped him notch and fit. while something deep in his chest pulled him back toward that impossible thing sitting in the wildflower meadow. On the fourth morning, he gave up pretending he could ignore it. "Come on, old boy," he said to Rufus, who lifted his grizzled head from his place by the wood stove. "Time to face whatever that thing is." But when they reached the meadow, Rufus planted his feet at the tree line and refused to go further. The dog sat down hard, fixing Elijah with those knowing brown eyes that had seen him through a dozen mountain winters. It was the look that said, clear as words, "This is a bad idea, old man, and you know it." Elijah knelt beside his companion, scratching behind the ears that had gone white with age. "I know, boy. I know it don't make sense, but sometimes a man's got to do things that don't make sense." He pulled an old military compass from his jacket pocket, a habit from his surveying days, and set it on a fallen log. The needle spun wildly for a moment, then pointed directly at the stone, before swinging back to magnetic north. That should have been impossible. The stone wasn't magnetic, at least not in any way he understood. Walking closer, Elijah noticed details he'd missed in his first shock. The symbols carved into the surface weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like sentences in some forgotten language. Some looked like stars, others like trees or mountains. A few resembled animals, bears, eagles, wolves. But there were stranger shapes too, things that hurt his eyes to look at directly, as if they belonged to a geometry that didn't quite fit in the regular world. The silver veins running through the dark stone pulsed stronger now, and he could definitely hear the humming. It wasn't unpleasant, more like the sound of bees in summer clover, or the low note Sarah used to hum while kneading bread. But underneath it, he sensed something vast and patient, like the mountains themselves had learned to speak. He reached out with one weathered hand, fingers stopping just short of the stone surface. The air above it felt warm, though the October morning carried winter's promise. Close up, he could see that the carvings weren't just surface deep, they went all the way through, as if the stone had been grown around them rather than carved. "What are you?" he whispered. The humming grew stronger, and for just a moment, Elijah could have sworn he heard voices, distant, echoing, speaking in languages that predated English, Spanish, even the Blackfoot and Crow tongues he'd learned fragments of during his years in Montana. The voices seemed to be calling, not to him exactly, but to something inside him, something he'd forgotten he possessed. That's when he noticed his hands were shaking. Not with fear, though there was plenty of that. Not with cold, though the morning air bit at his exposed skin. His hands shook with recognition, with a memory so deep it lived in his bones rather than his mind. He'd felt this pull before, though he couldn't say when or where. Behind him, Rufus whined softly. The dog had crept closer, close enough that Elijah could feel his warm breath on the back of his neck. Together, they stared at the impossible stone that had no business existing in their quiet mountain meadow. "My grandfather used to tell stories," Elijah said aloud, needing to hear a human voice even if it was his own, "and said these mountains were old when the first people came. Said there were things here that didn't follow regular rules. He dismissed those stories as childhood fancy, the way city-raised boys often did when old mountain men spoke of mysteries. But standing here now, with his pulse hammering in his ears and the stone humming its ancient song, Elijah remembered his grandfather's weathered face, the serious way the old man had looked him in the eye. Some stones remember, boy. Remember things from before memory was memory. You find one that calls to you, you best listen close. But you be careful, memory can cut both ways. His grandfather had been full of such sayings, mixing Cherokee wisdom with Irish superstition and 40 years of mountain living. Elijah's father had called it nonsense, the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the high country. But now, facing this impossible thing, Elijah wondered if his grandfather had known something the rest of them had forgotten. The stone surface was perfectly smooth, like river rock polished by centuries of flowing water. But no river had ever flowed through this meadow, and no natural process could have created something so perfectly round, so deliberately marked. As Elijah leaned closer, he caught sight of his reflection in the dark surface, and for just a moment, he saw someone else entirely, a younger man, dressed in buckskins and wearing a beaded necklace he'd never owned. The face was his but not his, familiar but strange. The eyes held knowledge he'd never possessed, spoke of places he'd never been. The reflection lasted only a heartbeat before snapping back to his own weathered features, but it left him dizzy and grasping. "What the hell?" he breathed. This time, when he reached out, his fingers made contact. The world exploded into light and sound and memory that wasn't his own. Images flashed through his mind like lightning. Vast forests untouched by axe or saw, rivers running clear as glass, mountains that scraped the belly of heaven itself. He saw people, but not people as he knew them. These moved with the earth rather than over it, spoke to trees and stones as easily as they spoke to each other, and he saw himself, not himself, but someone who wore his face in a different time. A man who knew the old ways, who could read the sky like scripture and speak to the stones in their own language. A man who carried responsibility like a great weight, who stood between two worlds and tried to hold them in balance. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Elijah found himself on his knees in the meadow grass, gasping like a drowning man. Rufus was beside him, whimpering and licking his face with desperate affection. The stone sat silent now, its humming stilled. But something fundamental had changed. Elijah knew, with the certainty of sunrise, that this stone held answers to questions he'd carried his whole life without knowing. Why he'd always felt like a stranger in his own skin. Why the mountains called to him with voices older than wind. Why Sarah's death had felt less like an ending and more like a pause, as if some larger story was still being written. He also knew, with equal certainty, that opening this stone would change everything. Not just for him, but for the delicate balance he'd built in these mountains, the careful peace he'd negotiated with solitude and grief. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again, but as he knelt there in the autumn grass, with his faithful dog pressed against his side and the weight of 72 years on his shoulders, Elijah Cormack realized he was tired of being careful, tired of living half a life in the shadow of memories he couldn't quite grasp. The stone had called to him, and something deep in his soul was ready to answer. He stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked back to his cabin. In the tool shed, beside Sarah's old gardening implements, he found what he was looking for, a heavy steel chisel and his old mining hammer. Tools he'd used decades ago when helping clear rockfall from the county road. Rufus followed him back to the meadow, still unhappy but loyal. The stone waited, patient as winter, humming its low song that seemed to vibrate in his chest cavity. Elijah positioned the chisel along one of the silver veins, raised the hammer, and hesitated. "Forgive me, Sarah," he whispered. "But I got to know." The hammer fell. The chisel bit deep into the silver vein, and the stone cracked with a sound like thunder rolling through mountain valleys. Light spilled from the fissure, not ordinary light, but something golden and warm that seemed to carry music within it. Elijah staggered backward as the crack widened, revealing not the hollow interior he'd expected, but something that defied all reason. Inside the stone was a space that couldn't exist, vast as a cathedral, filled with swirling mists that glowed like captured starlight. And floating in that impossible space was a leather journal, bound in hide so old it should have crumbled to dust centuries ago, yet perfectly preserved. The journal pulsed with the same gentle rhythm as the stone's silver veins. Rufus had retreated to the far edge of the meadow, but his whimpering had stopped. Instead, the old dog sat perfectly still, watching with the intensity of a creature witnessing something beyond his understanding, but not beyond his acceptance. Animals, Elijah had learned, were often wiser about such things than men. With trembling fingers, he reached into the light and grasped the journal. The moment his skin touched the ancient leather, the world shifted around him like a photograph coming into focus. The familiar meadow remained, but now he could see layers beneath it, shadows of what had been, whispers of what might be. The very air seemed alive with possibilities. The journal felt warm in his hands and heavier than it should have been, as if it carried the weight of untold stories. When he opened the cover, his breath caught in his throat. The pages were filled with handwriting he recognized, though he'd never seen it before. It was his own hand, but different, more confident, more practiced, written with quills and ink instead of ballpoint pens. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1847. The vision came again last night. The old woman by the sacred pool, speaking in the tongue of the first people. She says the stonekeepers are failing, that the barriers grow thin. I understand now why grandfather chose me, though the burden sits heavy on my shoulders. The journal must be preserved, the knowledge passed down. When the time comes, I will know. Elijah's hands shook as he turned the page. More entries, spanning decades, all in his handwriting, yet describing a life he'd never lived. A life where he'd been born into the mountains 2 centuries ago, raised by a Cherokee grandfather who taught him the old ways, trained him to be a guardian of ancient secrets. October 3rd, 1851. The miners came today, their gold lust bright in their eyes. They cannot see the sacred markings on the canyon walls, cannot hear the stones singing their warnings. I led them away from the burial grounds, told them the rock was too unstable for digging. Sometimes the old deception served the greater truth. Page after page revealed a world hidden beneath the one he knew. A world where certain people were chosen to stand between the seen and unseen, where stones like the one before him served as repositories of memory and wisdom. The journal spoke of other guardians scattered across the continent, each protecting their portion of an ancient network that kept the world in balance. December 21st, 1863. The winter visions grow stronger. I see a great war coming, not just between North and South, but between the old ways and the new. The sacred sites will be forgotten. The stone keepers will die without passing on their knowledge. But the stones remember. They always remember. I must find a way to preserve what we know, to hide it until the time of awakening comes. Elijah looked up from the journal, his mind reeling. The cracked stone continued to emit its gentle light, and he could see now that the symbols carved into its surface were moving, rearranging themselves into new patterns. They weren't random markings at all, but a kind of living text that shifted based on who was reading it and what they needed to know. A cool breeze stirred the meadow grass, carrying scents that didn't belong to any October morning he'd ever known. Cedar smoke and sweetgrass, the green smell of rain on desert stone, the musk of animals long extinct. It was as if the opening of the stone had torn a hole in time itself, allowing the past to bleed through into the present. He turned another page, and his heart nearly stopped. January 12th, 1875. I have seen the face of the one who will come after. He will wear my face but not know my name, will carry my soul but not my memories. The great forgetting will claim him as it has claimed so many others. But when the stone calls, he will answer. This I know as surely as I know the mountains will endure. The entry was accompanied by a sketch, a man in military uniform, older but unmistakably himself. Below it, in that familiar yet foreign handwriting, were the words Elijah Cormack, born 1953, keeper of the stone, awakened 2025. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the grass. The journal fell open in his lap to a page near the back, filled with detailed drawings of the meadow where he now knelt. But in these drawings, the meadow was different, dotted with other stones, each one carved with different symbols, forming a pattern that his modern eyes could barely comprehend, but his deeper soul recognized instantly. The final entry, written in his own hand but with ink still wet. If you are reading this, then the awakening has begun. You are not Elijah Cormack of Montana, born in 1953. Though that life is real and those memories are true, you are also stands between worlds, the last of the stonekeepers, charged with protecting the sacred sites until the time of great change. That time is now. The barriers weaken, the old enemies stir, And you, my brother across time, must remember who you truly are. A shadow fell across the meadow, though the sky remained clear. Rufus growled low in his throat, a sound Elijah had never heard from his gentle companion. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if a storm were building despite the cloudless October day. And in that heaviness, Elijah sensed something watching him, something that had noticed the opening of the stone and was not pleased by what it revealed. The journal's pages fluttered in a wind that touched nothing else, settling on a map drawn in the same careful hand. It showed the Montana Territory as it had existed in the 1800s, marked with dozens of symbols indicating sacred sites, stone circles, and places of power. Most were crossed out in red ink, with dates noting their destruction or abandonment. But a few remained, including the meadow where he now sat, and 3 others scattered across the high country. At the bottom of the map, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into his vision, were the words, "When the stone sings, the others will answer. When the others answer, the guardians will wake. When the guardians wake, the true work begins." Elijah closed the journal and held it against his chest, feeling the warm pulse of the leather binding synchronize with his own heartbeat. Everything he'd believed about his life, his purpose, his very identity, lay in ruins around him, like the shattered remnants of the stone. But beneath the shock and confusion, something else was stirring, a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before, as if he was finally becoming the man he was always meant to be. Rufus trotted over and nuzzled his hand, no longer afraid. The old dog's eyes held a new intelligence, as if the opening of the stone had awakened something in him as well. Together, they looked at the cracked stone, still glowing softly in the afternoon light, and Elijah knew his quiet life in the mountains was over. The awakening had begun, and there was no going back. That night, Elijah sat at his kitchen table with the journal spread open before him, a pot of coffee growing cold at his elbow. The pages revealed themselves slowly, as if the ancient leather knew he could only absorb so much truth at once. Each entry painted a clearer picture of the man he had been, stands between worlds. A Cherokee Irish keeper of sacred sites who had lived and died in these same mountains over a century ago. The memories came in fragments, triggered by words or symbols in the journal. He remembered a grandfather with silver braids who taught him to read the language of stones. A sacred pool where the water ran uphill and showed visions of what was to come. A responsibility that felt heavier than the mountains themselves. The knowledge that he stood guard against forces most people couldn't even imagine. But the modern Elijah's memories were real too. Vietnam. Sarah, 40 years of quiet mountain living. Somehow impossibly he was both men. The journal explained it as the soul's way of learning what it needed to know, living different lives across time to gather the wisdom necessary for its true purpose. The awakening brings confusion. One entry read, "Do not fight the memories of both lives. They are threads in the same tapestry, patterns in the same great weaving. The man who loved Sarah teaches you about loss and healing. The soldier who fought in distant jungles teaches you about protecting what matters. All of it prepares you for what comes next." Rufus lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to stare at shadows that weren't quite there. The dog's behavior had changed since the stone's opening. He was more alert, more purposeful, as if he too was remembering something long forgotten. When Elijah reached down to scratch his ears, he could have sworn he felt the animal's thoughts brushing against his own, wordless but clear. "I remember too, old friend. I remember around midnight, the journal revealed its most disturbing secret. Mixed among the keeper's duties were warnings about the others, beings that existed in the spaces between worlds, feeding on the energy that leaked through when the barriers weakened. They were ancient things, older than human civilization, patient as glaciers and hungry as wildfire. The stone network had been built to keep them at bay, but centuries of neglect had weakened the defenses. "They sense when a stone awakens," the journal warned. "They will come testing, probing for weakness. The first sign is always the same. Shadows that move independently, cold spots that appear without cause, animals that act strangely. Do not face them alone. The network exists for a reason. As if summoned by his reading, a chill swept through the cabin despite the warm fire in the wood stove. Rufus growled, hackles rising, and fixed his gaze on the far corner of the kitchen. Elijah followed the dog's stare and felt his blood turn to ice. Something was standing there, not quite visible, more like a distortion in the air. A place where the shadows bent wrong, and the light refused to go. The thing had no fixed shape, but Elijah could sense its attention, like a physical weight. It was studying him, evaluating, trying to determine if the newly awakened keeper represented a threat or an opportunity. The journal fell open to a page filled with protective symbols, and without conscious thought, Elijah began tracing one of them in the air with his finger. The shadow thing recoiled, as if burned, then melted away through the cabin wall like smoke. But its message was clear. They knew he was here, and they were not afraid of one old man with half-remembered powers. Elijah spent the rest of the night reading, absorbing everything the journal could teach him about his inherited responsibilities. By dawn, he understood that the stone in the meadow was only the beginning. According to the map in the journal, 3 other stones remained active in the Montana high country, each one guarded by a keeper who had probably forgotten their true nature, just as he had. The journal provided their names and approximate locations. Maria Santos, a park ranger at Glacier National Park who had reported unusual geological phenomena for years. Thomas Blackbear, a tribal elder on the Blackfeet Reservation who was known for his uncanny ability to predict weather and find lost hikers. And Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a retired geology professor living alone near Yellowstone, who had published papers on anomalous magnetic readings in certain rock formations. All 3 were approaching the age when the awakening typically occurred. All 3 would be experiencing strange dreams, unexplained attractions to certain places, a growing sense that their quiet lives were about to change forever. And if the journal was right, all 3 were in danger. The others would target them just as they had targeted him, but awakened keepers were vulnerable during the first few days after their stones opened. Without proper preparation, without understanding what they faced, the new guardians could be overwhelmed. Their power turned against the very network they were meant to protect. As the sun rose over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Elijah made his decision. He couldn't contact the others by phone or letter. The journal was clear that such mundane communications could be intercepted and corrupted by the others. Instead, he would have to visit each keeper personally, help them through their awakening, and begin the process of rebuilding the network that had once protected this land. But first, he needed to strengthen his own connection to the stone. The journal described rituals, meditations, and practices that would help him access the full range of his abilities. He was no longer just Elijah Cormack, retired Army meteorologist and widower. He was stands between worlds, and he had work to do. The cracked stone in the meadow pulsed brighter as he approached, as if sensing his newfound determination. When he placed his hands on its surface, the silver veins flared to life, and knowledge flowed into him like water into a desert. He learned to read the stone's songs, to interpret the patterns of light and shadow that danced across its surface. He learned to extend his awareness beyond his physical senses, feeling the pulse of the other stones scattered across the wilderness. They were stirring. After decades of dormancy, the network was beginning to wake up. But so were the things that had been waiting for this moment. Patient predators that had spent generations preparing for the barriers to weaken enough for them to act. Rufus sat beside him. No longer just a faithful dog, but a true companion in every sense of the word. The animal's thoughts touched his own with increasing clarity, sharing memories of other lives, other keepers, other battles fought in the shadows between worlds. Together, they would face whatever came next. The war for the old ways was about to begin. And Elijah Cormack finally understood why he had spent 72 years learning how to be strong. The drive to Glacier National Park took Elijah through country he'd known for decades. But everything looked different now. The journal lay open on the passenger seat beside him, its pages fluttering occasionally, though no wind stirred inside the old pickup truck. Rufus rode in the back, alert and watching the tree line with an intensity that made passing drivers give them a wide berth. What had once been familiar landscape now revealed hidden layers of meaning. Certain groves of aspen trees hummed with barely audible music. Rock formations cast shadows that didn't match the angle of the sun. And everywhere, if he looked with the right kind of sight, Elijah could see the faint lines of energy that connected sacred sites across the wilderness, like a vast spiderweb of power. The journal had taught him to read these signs, but the knowledge came with a price. The more he opened himself to the hidden world, the more vulnerable he became to the things that hunted in the spaces between. Twice during the 4-hour drive, he'd caught glimpses of shadow shapes keeping pace with his truck, running alongside in his peripheral vision like wolves made of darkness. Maria Santos worked out of the park's research station near Lake McDonald, a cluster of government buildings nestled among towering cedars and whitebark pines. According to the journal, she was a 30-year veteran of the Park Service, known for her meticulous documentation of geological anomalies and her uncanny ability to predict landslides and rockfalls days before they occurred. What her colleagues attributed to scientific expertise was actually something far older, the stonekeeper's instinctive connection to the living earth. Elijah found her at a seismic monitoring station on the lake's north shore, hunched over a computer screen that displayed wave patterns and frequency readings. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 55, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands stained with rock dust. But when she looked up at his approach, her dark eyes held the same depth he'd seen in his own mirror since the awakening. Dr. Santos. He kept his voice casual, though his heart was hammering. "I'm Elijah Cormack. I was hoping we could talk about the unusual readings you've been getting lately." Her expression grew guarded. "I'm sorry, but seismic data isn't really public information. If you're a researcher, you'll need to go through proper channels." "The readings started 3 days ago," Elijah interrupted gently. "Right around midnight. Not seismic activity exactly, but something deeper. Something that makes your equipment sing songs it was never designed to play." Maria's face went pale. She glanced around the empty monitoring station, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. "How could you possibly know that?" "I haven't reported it yet because I don't understand what I'm seeing. The frequency patterns don't match any known geological phenomena, but they're definitely coming from underground." Deep underground. Elijah pulled the journal from his jacket and let it fall open to the page, showing her photograph. A younger Maria in hiking gear, standing beside a stone circle that had supposedly been destroyed by mining operations in the 1920s. Beneath the photo, in that familiar handwriting, was a detailed description of her role as keeper of the Northern Gate. "I know because I've been going through the same thing," he said quietly. 3 days ago, something woke up that's been sleeping for a very long time. And whether you remember it or not, Dr. Santos, you've been chosen to help protect this land from what's coming." She stared at the journal with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "This is impossible. That photograph, I've never seen it before, but I know that place. I dream about it sometimes. A circle of standing stones hidden in a valley that shouldn't exist, where the northern lights dance even in summer. The dreams are getting stronger, aren't they?" Elijah asked. "More vivid, more real. And you're starting to remember things that never happened to you, at least not in this lifetime." Maria nodded slowly, her scientific training warring with something deeper and more instinctive. "Yesterday, I found myself speaking Blackfoot to a group of tourists, even though I've never studied the language. But I knew what the words meant, knew exactly what I was trying to tell them about the spirit of the glacier. That's because you're remembering who you really are," Elijah said. Who you've always been underneath the life you've lived in this century. Your stone is calling to you, Dr. Santos, just like mine called to me. He told her about the meadow, the cracked stone, the journal that had revealed his true identity. As he spoke, he watched understanding dawn in her eyes, followed quickly by fear. The rational part of her mind was struggling to reject what he was saying, but her deeper self recognized the truth. If this is real, she whispered, if I really am some kind of guardian, then what happened to the others? The journal shows dozens of sites, but you're saying most of them are dormant. Destroyed, abandoned, or forgotten, Elijah confirmed. The network that once protected this entire region has been reduced to 4 active sites, including yours. And there are things out there that have been waiting for this moment, when the barriers are weakest and the guardians are just beginning to remember. As if summoned by his words, the temperature around the monitoring station dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. The electronic equipment began registering impossible readings, seismic waves that traveled faster than light, magnetic fluctuations that spiked beyond the instrument's ability to measure. And in the shadows cast by the towering cedars, shapes began to move with predatory purpose. Rufus materialized from the tree line, hackles raised and teeth bared at threats only he could see. The old dog positioned himself between the humans and the encroaching darkness, a low growl rumbling in his chest that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Maria grabbed Elijah's arm, her fingernails digging through his jacket sleeve. "What is that? What's happening?" "They've found us," he said grimly, pulling the journal closer. The pages began flipping of their own accord, settling on a passage about protective wards and emergency protocols. "Your stone is close, isn't it? Within walking distance? How did you—" "Yes. There's a place about a mile north of here, in a valley the maps don't show properly. I've always felt drawn to it, but I never— The readings there are off the charts. Electromagnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist in nature. That's where we need to go." Right now, Elijah started toward his truck, then paused as the shadows seemed to solidify around them. 3 distinct forms emerged from the darkness, not quite human, but wearing human shape like an ill-fitting disguise. Their eyes were holes in reality, and when they spoke, their voices came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The Keeper awakens," they said in unison. "But awakening brings vulnerability. Join us willingly and your transition will be gentle." Maria stepped backward, her scientific worldview crumbling in the face of impossible reality. But Elijah stood his ground, the journal open in his hands to a page filled with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "You have no power here," he said, tracing one of the protective sigils in the air. "This land is protected by agreements older than your hunger." The shadow beings laughed, a sound like ice breaking in spring thaw. "Agreements written in a dead language, enforced by a forgotten people. The network fails, old man. Soon we will walk freely in all the spaces between." But their confidence wavered as Maria suddenly straightened, her fear transforming into something harder and more dangerous. Power flickered around her like heat lightning, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the air itself shiver. "Not while I draw breath," she said, and the words came out in fluent Blackfoot, though she'd spoken English moments before. "Not while the stones remember their purpose." The confrontation was about to begin in earnest. The shadow beings recoiled from Maria's words, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to circle like predators testing their prey, their forms shifting between human and something far more ancient. Elijah could feel their hunger pressing against his mind, not for flesh or blood, but for the energy that flowed through the stone network, the power that kept their kind trapped in the spaces between worlds. "We need to reach your stone," he told Maria urgently. "Once you make contact, once you complete the awakening, they won't be able to touch you. But until then, we're vulnerable," she finished, her newfound abilities flickering like a candle in wind. "The valley. It's this way." They ran through the forest with Rufus leading the way, the old dog somehow knowing exactly where they needed to go. Behind them, The shadow beings gave chase, their forms flowing between the trees like smoke made solid. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the pine needles, despite the warm October afternoon. The valley Maria led them to defied conventional geography. Hidden behind a ridge that should have been solid granite, it opened into a circular depression, perhaps 100 yards across. At its center stood a stone unlike anything in Elijah's experience, not round like his own, but tall and narrow, shaped like a doorway. Its surface was covered in symbols that moved constantly, glowing across the dark stone like water made of light. "The Northern Gate," Maria breathed, and Elijah realized she was translating the Blackfoot words that had spilled from her lips. The place where the aurora touches the earth. Even in broad daylight, the stone seemed to pulse with the green-gold light of the northern aurora. But something was wrong. The symbols on its surface were moving too frantically, and the light that emanated from within was tainted with streaks of sickly yellow that had no place in nature's palette. "It's been corrupted," Elijah said, consulting the journal. The pages showed him diagrams of what a healthy gatestone should look like, and this wasn't it. "The others have been working on it, trying to twist it to their purposes." Maria approached the stone cautiously, her hands extended. "I can feel it calling to me, but there's something else too. Something hungry and cold that wants to use me as a conduit." The shadow beings emerged from the tree line, no longer bothering to maintain human appearance. They were tall and impossibly thin, with too many joints and faces that existed in dimensions the human eye couldn't properly process. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that made reality shiver. "The gate weakens," they said. "Soon we will pour through like water through a broken dam. You cannot stop what has already begun." But Elijah was studying the journal's instructions for purifying a corrupted stone, ancient rituals that required two keepers working in perfect harmony. "Maria, I need you to place your hands on the stone at the exact moment I complete the purification ritual. But you have to trust me completely. If we're not synchronized, the backlash could destroy us both." "I don't understand any of this," she said, fear and wonder warring in her voice. "Yesterday, I was a park ranger with a PhD in geology. Today, I'm supposed to be some kind of mystical guardian?" "You've always been a guardian," Elijah replied gently. "The PhD just gave you tools to understand what you were protecting. The ranger badge gave you authority to preserve it. Everything in your life has been preparing you for this moment." One of the shadow beings glided closer, its form rippling like heat waves. "Join us willingly, daughter of the earth. We offer power beyond your imagining, knowledge that spans eons. Why serve the dead traditions when you could help birth a new age?" Maria looked at the creature, then at the corrupted stone, then at Elijah with his weathered face and steady eyes. "Because," she said firmly, "some things are worth preserving exactly as they are." The purification ritual was unlike anything Elijah had ever experienced. Following the journal's instructions, he began tracing complex patterns in the air while speaking words in a language that predated human civilization. The symbols came from somewhere deeper than memory, flowing through him as if he were merely a conduit for knowledge that belonged to the stones themselves. Maria matched his movements instinctively, her hands dancing in perfect counterpoint to his own. The corrupted stone began to respond, its sickly yellow light wavering as ancient cleansing energies washed through its crystalline structure. But the shadow beings weren't passive observers. They attacked with everything they had, trying to break the ritual before it could be completed. Waves of cold that could freeze marrow crashed against them. Whispers of despair tried to convince them that their efforts were futile, that the corruption had spread too far to be reversed. Images of failure and loss flooded their minds. Elijah saw Sarah dying again and again, while Maria watched the wilderness she'd devoted her life to protecting burn in endless fires. But they held firm, anchored by their shared purpose and the growing harmony between their awakening powers. Rufus circled them protectively, his growls providing a bass note that seemed to strengthen their resolve. And slowly, gradually, the stone began to clear. The yellow corruption retreated like infection before a strong antibiotic. The frantic movement of symbols slowed to a stately dance that spoke of order restored and balance maintained. And when the ritual reached its crescendo, when Maria finally placed her palms flat against the stone's surface, the northern gate burst into glory. Pure aurora light erupted from the stone, washing over the valley in waves of green and gold and silver. The shadow beings shrieked as the light touched them, their forms dissolving like smoke in a strong wind. For a moment that felt like eternity, the valley was filled with the music of the spheres, a harmony so perfect it made both humans weep with joy. Then the light stabilized, settling into the gentle pulsing rhythm that indicated a healthy gate stone. Maria stood with her hands still pressed against its surface, tears streaming down her face as memories of dozens of lifetimes flooded through her. She was Dr. Maria Santos, park ranger and geologist. She was also Walks with Thunder, keeper of the Northern Gate, guardian of the aurora paths that connected earth to sky. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember all of it. The responsibility, the loneliness, the weight of protecting something most people can never understand, but also the purpose," Elijah added, closing the journal with satisfaction. "The knowledge that you stand between chaos and order, that your sacrifice preserves something beautiful and essential." The shadow beings were gone, but they would return. And next time, they would be ready for awakened keepers. The network was beginning to stir, but it was still far from complete. 2 more stones waited, 2 more guardians needed awakening, and somewhere in the darkness between worlds, ancient minds were plotting new strategies for the war that had just begun in earnest. 3 days later, as they prepared to seek out Thomas Blackbear on the Blackfeet Reservation, the journal revealed its most devastating secret. Elijah had been reading through entries he'd somehow missed before, passages that appeared only when the reader was ready to understand their implications. The truth, when it came, hit him like a physical blow. The network hadn't been failing due to neglect or the passage of time. It had been systematically sabotaged from within. "Maria," he called, his voice tight with shock. "You need to see this." She looked up from her own studies. She'd been comparing the journal's maps with modern geological surveys, trying to locate the remaining active sites. Since her awakening, her scientific training had merged seamlessly with her mystical knowledge, creating insights that neither aspect of her identity could have achieved alone. The journal entry was dated March 15, 1892, written in a hand that shook with rage and betrayal. "I was wrong about Harrison. Wrong about everything. He wasn't captured by the others. He joined them willingly. For 20 years, I trusted him as my closest ally, never suspecting that every sight we've lost, every guardian who died mysteriously, every weakening of the network's defenses was his doing. The others don't just corrupt from outside. They recruit from within, turning our greatest strengths against us. He came to me tonight with an offer. Join them, and Sarah's death would be reversed. They showed me visions of her alive and laughing, of the life we could have together if I simply opened the remaining gates and let them through. When I refused, he laughed and told me the truth. There are 5 active sites, not 4. The 5th keeper has been working against us from the beginning, using his knowledge of the network to undermine everything we've tried to protect. I don't know who among the current generation has been turned, but I know this. When the awakening comes, when the stones begin to sing again, the traitor will reveal himself. And God help us all when he does. Elijah's blood turned to ice as he read the final line. "Beware the one who knows too much too soon, who guides you to the others with perfect knowledge, who carries a journal that should not exist, his own journal." The very book that had led him to Maria, that contained detailed information about all the keepers and their locations. The journal that had appeared in the stone, exactly when and how he needed it, as if someone had placed it there specifically for him to find. "This can't be right," he whispered. But even as he spoke, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with horrible clarity. How had he known exactly where to find Maria? How had he understood the purification ritual so perfectly? How had he been able to read ancient languages he'd never studied, perform ceremonies he'd never learned? Maria was studying his face with growing alarm. "Elijah, what is it? What does it say?" But before he could answer, the temperature in Maria's research station began dropping rapidly. The electronic equipment started registering impossible readings again, but this time the disturbance was coming from directly below them. Something vast was stirring in the deep places of the earth, responding to a signal only it could hear. The journal's pages flipped wildly on their own, settling on a passage that made Elijah's heart stop. The final trap is always the same. The turned keeper believes himself to be the hero of his own story, believes he is saving the network, when in fact he is delivering it into the enemy's hands. He will gather the guardians together, convince them to trust him, lead them to perform the great opening that will tear down all barriers at once. And he will do it willingly, joyfully, believing until the very end that he serves the light. "No," Elijah breathed. "No, this isn't possible. I remember being stands between worlds. I remember my grandfather, the sacred pool, the responsibility." "Do you?" Maria asked quietly. "Or do you remember what someone wanted you to remember?" The memories he'd thought were so clear began to waver like heat mirages. Had his grandfather really taught him the old ways, or had that knowledge been implanted by something that understood exactly how to manipulate a lonely old man? Had Stands Between Worlds really been his past self, or was that identity a carefully crafted fiction designed to make him trust the journal's guidance? Rufus whined and pressed against his legs, but even the dog's loyalty felt suddenly suspect. How had Rufus known exactly where to lead them? How had the animal shown such perfect understanding of supernatural threats? What if his faithful companion was something else entirely, something sent to guide him along a predetermined path? The journal fell open to one final entry, this one written in a different hand entirely, angular, precise, utterly cold. "The asset has performed exactly as programmed. He has awakened the Northern Gate and recruited the Santos woman. Soon he will lead us to the remaining keepers, and we will corrupt them all simultaneously. The great opening approaches. When all 5 stones sing in harmony, the barriers will fall forever, and we will pour through like a tide of shadow. The humans will never know that their greatest protector delivered them into our hands. The beauty of it is perfect. Even now, reading these words, he will try to convince himself that this is another deception, another test. He will rationalize, deny, make excuses, because the alternative, that everything he believes about himself is a lie, is too terrible to accept. Elijah staggered backward, the journal falling from nerveless fingers. Every memory of the past week replayed itself in a new and horrible light. The stone calling to him, the convenient appearance of the journal, his perfect knowledge of rituals and locations he should never have known, all of it orchestrated by minds far older and more cunning than his own. But the worst part was the growing certainty that he couldn't trust his own reactions to this revelation. Was his horror genuine, or was it part of the programming? Was his desire to protect the network real, or had it been implanted to make him a more effective weapon against it? Maria was backing away from him, power flickering around her hands as her own awakened instincts warned her of danger. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What are you?" "I don't know," Elijah said, and those 3 words contained more anguish than he'd felt since Sarah's death. "I honestly don't know anymore." Outside, storm clouds were gathering despite the clear weather forecast, and in the distance, something that might have been thunder rolled across the mountains. But Elijah suspected it wasn't thunder at all. It was the sound of barriers beginning to crack, of ancient prisons starting to open, and he might be the key that would unlock them all. The journal lay open on the floor between them, its pages now blank except for a single line that appeared as they watched. "The final act begins. Choose quickly, Elijah Cormac. Save yourself or save the world. You cannot do both." Above them, the first snow of an unseasonable blizzard began to fall, and in that snow shadow shapes danced with predatory joy. The blizzard that shouldn't exist raged for 2 days, trapping them in Maria's research station while they grappled with the terrible implications of the journal's revelation. Elijah spent hours staring at his reflection in the ice-covered windows, searching for some sign of his true nature, some way to know if the man looking back was hero or weapon. Maria kept her distance, her awakened senses constantly probing for signs of corruption or deception. She'd studied the journal's warnings about turned keepers, memorizing the subtle tells that might indicate an infiltrator. But Elijah displayed none of them. His anguish seemed genuine, his confusion real, his desire to protect the network apparently sincere. "The problem," she said on the second morning, "is that the most effective sleeper agents don't know what they are. If you've been programmed, the programming would include genuine emotions, real relationships, authentic memories of love and loss." Elijah nodded without looking away from the window. Outside, the unnatural storm continued to rage, and shapes moved in the swirling snow that were definitely not natural. "Sarah was real," he said quietly. "I know that much. Whatever else might be false, my love for her was genuine. But did you meet her by chance, or were you guided to her? Did she love you freely, or was she influenced by the same forces that shaped you?" Maria's questions were gentle but relentless. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Elijah, but we need to know what we're dealing with." The journal lay closed on the table between them, its leather binding dark with age. Since revealing its devastating secret, it had remained stubbornly blank, offering no new guidance or clarification. Rufus sat beside it, the old dog's behavior a constant puzzle. He showed no signs of supernatural influence, yet his knowledge of the hidden world was clearly beyond what any normal animal should possess. On the third morning, the storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. Brilliant sunshine flooded the valley, revealing a landscape transformed by 3 feet of unseasonable snow. But the beauty of the winter scene was marred by what they found written in the pristine white surface, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Messages in a language that predated human speech. "They're calling for a gathering," Maria translated, her face pale with understanding. "All the keepers, all the stones, brought together for the great opening. They're not even hiding their intentions anymore." Elijah read the symbols with sick comprehension. The others were offering him a choice: bring the remaining keepers to a specific location in the Yellowstone backcountry, or watch as they destroyed every stone site simultaneously, tearing holes in reality that could never be repaired. Either way, the barriers would fall. But if he cooperated, some remnant of the network might survive. "It's a trap," Maria said. "Obviously. But what if it's also an opportunity?" They spent the day studying maps and satellite imagery of the proposed meeting site, a remote valley in the Yellowstone wilderness, dozens of miles from the nearest road. According to geological surveys, the area showed unusual magnetic properties and frequent seismic activity, despite being far from any known fault lines. If there was a 5th stone hidden there, it would be the largest and most powerful in the network. "The Heart Stone," Elijah said, "memories surfacing that might or might not be real. The central hub that coordinates all the others." "I thought it was just legend. Everything we've encountered was supposedly legend until 3 days ago," Maria pointed out. "The question is, if we gather the other keepers there, are we helping the others complete their plan, or are we giving ourselves the best chance to stop them?" The debate raged through the afternoon and into the evening. "Trust nobody," the journal had warned, "especially not the one who knows too much." But if they didn't gather the remaining guardians, if they left Thomas Blackbear and Elizabeth Hayes to face the coming crisis alone, the others would pick them off one by one. Finally, as darkness fell and aurora light began dancing across the northern sky, Elijah made his decision. "We contact the others. We tell them everything about the network, about the threat, about my possible corruption. Then we let them choose whether to trust us or not. And if they refuse to come, if they decide you're too dangerous to trust, then they're probably right," Elijah said simply. "But at least they'll know what they're facing." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Thomas Blackbear arrived first, driving an ancient pickup truck that somehow navigated the snowy mountain roads without chains or four-wheel drive. He was a small man in his 70s, with silver braids and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the high plains. Behind him came Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, her modern SUV looking out of place beside his weathered vehicle. Elizabeth was perhaps 60, with short grey hair and the practical demeanour of someone who'd spent decades turning theoretical knowledge into practical solutions. But like the others, her eyes held depths that spoke of recent awakening, of memories suddenly restored after years of dormancy. "The stones called to us," Thomas said, without preamble. "Told us to come here, to meet the one who would either save or damn us all." His gaze fixed on Elijah with uncomfortable intensity. "Which are you, brother?" "I wish I knew," Elijah replied honestly. "But I think you're about to help me find out." They gathered around Maria's table while she explained everything they'd learned about the network, the others, and the possibility that Elijah was an unwitting saboteur. Thomas and Elizabeth listened in silence, occasionally asking questions that revealed their own fragmented memories of past lives and ancient responsibilities. "The dreams have been getting stronger," Elizabeth admitted. "I keep seeing a stone circle in a place that doesn't exist on any map, where the earth itself sings with geological forces I don't understand. And I see myself there, much younger, working with others to maintain some kind of balance. The visions started for me 6 months ago," Thomas added. "Grandfather spirits speaking in the old tongue, warning that the sacred sites were in danger. I thought it was just the wanderings of an old man's mind, until the earth began singing 3 days ago. Each keeper produced an artifact that had appeared mysteriously in their possession. Thomas carried a medicine bundle that contained stones from sacred sites across the northern plains, their surfaces covered in symbols that matched those in Elijah's journal. Elizabeth had found a geological survey map from the 1800s hidden in her office files, marking locations that corresponded perfectly with the network's nodes. "All roads lead to the Heartstone," Maria observed, studying the convergent evidence. "Whatever's going to happen, it's going to happen there." They spent the day planning, though planning for an event where one of your own allies might be a traitor presented unique challenges. Each keeper would approach the Heartstone from a different direction, maintaining communication through methods the others couldn't easily intercept. If Elijah showed signs of corruption or betrayal, the others were to contain him by any means necessary. "And if I'm not the turned keeper?" Elijah asked. "If this is all an elaborate deception to make us distrust each other, then we'll find out together," Thomas said. "But one way or another, the truth reveals itself when the stones sing in harmony. No deception can survive that level of spiritual resonance." As they prepared to leave for what might be their final confrontation, Rufus approached each keeper in turn, allowing them to scratch his ears and look into his ancient eyes. Whatever the dog truly was, loyal companion, supernatural guardian, or something else entirely, he would be with them to the end. The Heartstone waited in its hidden valley, surrounded by forces that had been patient for over a century. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions that had haunted them all their lives. Tomorrow would determine whether the barriers held or fell forever. Tonight they could only prepare as best they knew how, and trust that when the moment came, they would have the wisdom to choose correctly. The hidden valley revealed itself at dawn, appearing between two ridges that should have been solid granite according to every map ever drawn. One moment they were hiking through ordinary wilderness, the next they stood at the edge of something that challenged the very notion of geography. The valley stretched for miles in directions that hurt to contemplate, its boundaries shifting whenever observed directly. At its center rose the Heartstone. Elijah had tried to prepare himself for this moment, but nothing could have readied him for the reality. The stone wasn't simply large, it was monumental, a crystalline spire that twisted up from the earth like a frozen tornado. Its surface reflected aurora light even in broad daylight, and the symbols carved into its facets moved constantly. rearranging themselves into patterns that told the history of the world in languages that existed before words. "My God," Elizabeth whispered, her geological training warring with the evidence of her eyes. "It's not possible. The mass alone should have created gravitational anomalies visible from orbit. It exists in more dimensions than our instruments can measure," Thomas said quietly. His weather-beaten face was serene despite the impossibility before them. The old stories spoke of such places where the spirit world touches the physical realm so closely that normal rules no longer apply. Maria was taking readings with equipment she'd brought from the research station, but the instruments were registering values that shouldn't exist. Magnetic field strength is off the charts. Seismic activity suggests the stone extends down at least a mile, possibly more. And there's something else. Electromagnetic pulses that match the frequency of human brain waves. They approached the Heartstone from 4 directions, as planned, with Rufus ranging between them like a scout. The closer they got, the more reality seemed to bend around the ancient monument. Elijah found himself walking on ground that felt solid but looked transparent, as if the earth itself had become a window into some deeper realm. The journal had remained blank since its terrible revelation, but now words began appearing on its pages, not the careful script of stands between worlds, but something angular and alien that seemed to burn itself into the parchment. "Welcome, faithful servant. You have exceeded all expectations. The others trust you despite their suspicions. Soon they will join hands around the Heartstone, as you have guided them to do, and their combined power will shatter the barriers forever. The great opening begins now." Elijah stopped walking, his hands shaking as he read words that confirmed his worst fears. Everything, his awakening, his memories, his desperate desire to protect the network, had been orchestrated to bring them to this moment. He was the weapon the others had spent decades crafting, and he had delivered himself and his fellow keepers directly into their trap. "Elijah?" Maria called from 50 yards away. "What is it? What's wrong?" Before he could answer, the air around the Heartstone began to shimmer. Shadow forms materialized from nowhere, hundreds of them, surrounding the spire in concentric circles. But these weren't the crude approximations of humanity they'd faced before. These were the others in their true forms, beings of living darkness that existed between the spaces of reality, patient predators that had waited generations for this opportunity. Their leader stepped forward, and Elijah recognized him with a shock that nearly drove him to his knees. The creature wore the face of his grandfather, not as he'd known him in life, but as he appeared in the memories that had guided Elijah to this moment. The same silver braids, the same wise eyes, the same gentle smile that had taught him to love the mountains. "Well done, my boy," the false grandfather said, its voice a perfect mimicry of the old man's Cherokee-accented English. "You have brought them all together, just as we always knew you would. Even your doubts, your resistance, your desire to protect, all of it has served our purpose perfectly." Thomas, Maria, and Elizabeth had stopped their advance, power flickering around them as their awakened abilities responded to the threat. But they were badly outnumbered, and the Heartstone's emanations were interfering with their connection to their own stones. "The programming runs deeper than conscious thought," the creature continued, advancing on Elijah with predatory grace. "Every memory you treasure, every instinct you trust, every moment of love and loss that shaped you into the man you believe yourself to be, all crafted to make you the perfect weapon against the very thing you think you're protecting." Elijah wanted to deny it, to rage against the accusations, but the evidence was overwhelming. How else could he explain his perfect knowledge of Keeper lore? How else could he have found the others so easily? How else could he have guided them all to this exact spot at this exact moment? "But there's something you didn't account for," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Something your programming couldn't erase completely." The false grandfather's expression flickered with momentary uncertainty. "Impossible. We accounted for every variable, every possible deviation. You accounted for everything except Sarah. Elijah pulled her photograph from his wallet, not the one the others had provided in his false memories, but the real picture he'd carried for 40 years. The woman in the image was different from his implanted recollections. Younger, sadder, with eyes that held shadows the programmed version had never possessed. She wasn't part of your plan, was she? You needed me isolated, alone, vulnerable to manipulation. But I met her before you got to me, fell in love, before you could control that part of my life. And loving her, really loving her, created something in me that your programming couldn't touch. The creatures around the Heartstone began to stir restlessly, their forms wavering, as if the very mention of genuine love was somehow painful to them. The false grandfather snarled, its benevolent mask slipping to reveal something hungry and desperate beneath. Sentiment, it spat, human weakness. It changes nothing. You are here, they are here, and the ritual will proceed as planned. But Elijah was already moving, not toward the Heartstone as expected, but away from it. And as he moved, he began to speak, not in the languages the journal had taught him, but in words Sarah had whispered to him during their last night together. A prayer she'd learned from her own grandmother, a blessing that called on powers older than the others' hunger. The words cut through the air like silver blades, and wherever they touched, the shadow beings began to writhe and smoke. Because while the others had crafted Elijah's memories of being a keeper, while they had implanted knowledge of ancient rituals and forgotten languages, they had never touched the simple human love that was his true strength. And that love, it turned out, was the one thing they couldn't corrupt. Sarah's prayer cut through the shadow beings like sunlight through storm clouds, but Elijah knew it wouldn't be enough. The others had spent too long preparing for this moment, had invested too much power in corrupting the Heartstone. Even as their forms writhed and smoked under the assault of genuine love, they were already adapting, learning to shield themselves against the words that should have destroyed them. Now, he shouted to the other keepers, while they're weakened, form the circle. But instead of moving toward the Heartstone, as the others expected, Elijah ran in the opposite direction. Thomas understood first, his eyes widening with realization as he grasped the true strategy. The programming that made Elijah a weapon could also make him a conduit, but only if he willingly accepted that role, only if he chose to channel the network's power through himself rather than the corrupted monument. Maria and Elizabeth caught on moments later, their scientific minds grasping the elegant solution even as their mystical selves recoiled from its implications. They spread out to form a human circle around Elijah instead of the stone, linking hands across 50 yards of valley floor, while he stood at their center with Sarah's photograph pressed against his heart. Impossible, the false grandfather raged. The ritual requires the Heartstone. Without its amplification, you lack the power to maintain the barriers. You're right, Elijah said calmly. We can't maintain the barriers the way they were. But we can do something better. We can remake them. He began to speak again, but this time the words came from deeper than memory, deeper than programming, deeper even than the ancient knowledge the others had stolen and corrupted. They came from the part of his soul that had loved Sarah purely, that had grieved her loss honestly, that had spent 40 years learning to find beauty in solitude and strength in simplicity. The other keepers joined their voices to his, each adding their own thread to the growing tapestry of power. Thomas sang in Blackfoot, his words calling on the wisdom of the plains and the endurance of the mountains. Maria spoke in the language of stone and crystal, her scientific understanding transformed into something that could reshape reality at the molecular level. Elizabeth chanted formulas that turned geological forces into spiritual ones, making the earth itself a partner in their working. And Rufus, faithful Rufus, who had never been just a dog, added his own voice, a howl that carried harmonics no normal animal could produce, frequencies that resonated with the deepest foundations of the world. The false grandfather and his shadow army rushed toward them, desperate to break the circle before it could complete its work. But they were too late. Power was already flowing between the keepers, through Elijah, and out into the network in patterns that had nothing to do with the corrupted monuments they had once protected. Instead of maintaining the old barriers that kept the others trapped between worlds, the keepers were creating something new, a filter that would allow beneficial spiritual energy to flow freely while blocking anything tainted by hunger or malice. Not a wall but a membrane, not a prison, but a selective boundary that responded to intention rather than origin. The Heartstone, sensing its monopoly broken, began to pulse with frantic energy. Cracks appeared in its crystalline surface as centuries of accumulated corruption fought against the new paradigm. The shadow beings pressed their attack, but found themselves passing through the keepers like smoke through solid objects. The circle existed in a state of being they could no longer touch. "This is impossible!" the false grandfather snarled, its borrowed features distorting with rage. "You are human, mortal, limited." "Exactly," Elijah replied, and his voice carried Sarah's laughter, her warmth, her absolute faith in the goodness that could exist between flawed beings who chose to love anyway. "We're not trying to be gods. We're not trying to control everything. We're just trying to leave the world a little better than we found it." The new network snapped into place with a sound like crystal bells ringing across infinite distances. Suddenly, the old stone monuments were no longer necessary. Every keeper carried the connection within themselves. Every act of genuine care strengthened the web. Every moment of authentic love added another strand to the protection. The shadow beings shrieked as they found themselves not destroyed but transformed, their corruption burned away by contact with the purified network. Some fled back to the spaces between worlds, but others, those that had once been human, turned by despair or manipulation, began to remember who they had been before the others claimed them. The false grandfather made one last desperate attempt to reach Elijah, but as it drew near, its stolen features began to dissolve. Underneath was revealed not a monster but a broken soul, so ancient it had forgotten its own name. Consumed by jealousy of beings who could love freely despite their mortality. "You don't have to stay in the darkness," Elijah said gently. "There's room in the light for everyone willing to give up their hunger." The ancient being stared at him for a long moment, then at the photograph in his hands, then at the circle of keepers who had chosen transformation over domination. Slowly, incredibly, it nodded. The Heartstone collapsed into dust as the last of its corruption was purged. But the network it had anchored was stronger than ever, distributed now among 5 living guardians who would carry its protection wherever they went. The barriers were rebuilt, not as walls but as filters, not as permanent structures but as living systems that could grow and adapt. And at the center of it all, Elijah Cormac stood transformed, no longer a weapon disguised as a protector, but a guardian who had chosen love over programming, hope over despair, connection over isolation. 6 months later, Elijah sat on his cabin porch with his morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the Montana peaks in shades of gold and rose. The familiar ritual felt different now, not because the mountains had changed, but because he finally understood his place among them. The journal lay open beside him, its pages no longer blank but filled with new entries written in his own hand, documenting the gradual healing of sites across the continent. Rufus dozed in the morning sunshine, occasionally opening one eye to check on squirrel activity near the bird feeder Sarah had built. The old dog was definitely just a dog now, though a remarkably intelligent one who seemed to understand that his supernatural duties had ended with the network's transformation. Sometimes Elijah caught him looking wistful, as if he missed the ancient purpose that had shaped his life for so long. The new network operated differently than its predecessor. Instead of requiring constant vigilance from isolated guardians, it drew strength from connections between ordinary people who chose to care for the land and each other. Maria had returned to her Park Service duties, but now her geological surveys included spiritual assessments that helped identify places where the Earth itself was struggling. Thomas worked with tribal councils across the northern plains, teaching young people to recognize and nurture the sacred sites their ancestors had protected. Elizabeth published papers that bridged scientific observation with mystical understanding, helping a new generation of researchers recognize patterns that previous science had overlooked. And Elijah had become something he'd never expected, a teacher, not of ancient secrets or mystical traditions, but of simpler truths: how to listen to the land, how to find peace in solitude, how to build a life worth living in the spaces between what was lost and what might yet be found. The visitors started coming in spring, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations from people who'd heard about an old mountain man who understood things most folks couldn't explain. They were grieving spouses learning to live alone, veterans struggling with memories that wouldn't fade, young people who felt disconnected from a world that moved too fast and demanded too much. They came seeking answers, but mostly they found something better. Someone who listened without judgment and shared what he'd learned about finding meaning in the midst of loss. This morning's visitor was different, though. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes climbed the trail to his cabin with the measured pace of someone who'd spent decades studying mountain geology. But she carried herself differently than she had 6 months ago, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd discovered that her life's